Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, at my brother's birthday dinner, my dad stood up with his glass and gave a toast that should have been harmless. But the words he chose landed like a punch to the gut, because he raised his voice and said, "To the star of the family, the rest don't count." And people laughed, people clapped, and my brother grinned like he had just been knighted, while I sat there trying to swallow a lump in my throat so big it almost choked me. I have heard my dad say versions of that my whole life, little reminders that Tyler was the chosen one, the golden child, the one who mattered. But hearing it in front of a packed room, friends, cousins, aunts, even some of Tyler's business contacts, it was something else entirely, and I felt this heat rising in me, not because it was new, but because I suddenly realized I was done pretending it didn't bother me. The crazy part is, I wasn't even planning to speak up, because I've spent years telling myself it's not worth the fight, that I'd rather swallow the insult and keep the peace. But then my husband Mark, who had been sitting quietly beside me all night, leaned forward, slid a stack of papers across the table, and said in this calm, steady voice, "Funny toast, Richard, but these deposits didn't come from Tyler, they came from her," and suddenly the whole room went silent. You could have heard a fork hit the floor, and my brother's smirk froze midair like he didn't even understand what was happening, because for once the spotlight wasn't flattering, it was blinding, and people were staring at him, then staring at me, then staring at the papers Mark had just laid out in the middle of the table like evidence in a trial. Now, let me be clear, Mark didn't do this to embarrass anyone for sport. He did it because he has watched me for years carrying the weight of this family like some unpaid accountant, quietly covering bills that slipped through the cracks, transferring money when my parents' mortgage almost defaulted last winter, wiring funds to Tyler's business account to bridge him until a client paid, paying off the hospital deductible when my mom ended up in the ER and dad claimed his insurance was sorting it out. Every time I told Mark, "Don't say anything, it's just easier this way," and he nodded, but he also kept records, because he's the kind of man who believes if you're going to keep the peace, at least make sure the truth can't be erased. So here we were, at the birthday dinner, the truth spread across the table in the form of transfer receipts, canceled checks, even a neat little list of dates that showed how many times in the last 2 years I had been the one plugging holes in the so-called family ship. And instead of clapping, people were staring like they had been caught clapping for the wrong person. My dad tried to laugh it off, mumbling something about confusing paperwork, and you know how banks are, but Mark didn't raise his voice, he just said, "It's not confusing when the account name says Lauren Thompson every single time," and then he leaned back, folded his arms, and let the silence hang. I sat there, not sure if I wanted to crawl under the table or finally breathe for the first time in years, because as humiliating as it felt to have my private sacrifices turned into public spectacle, there was also this surge of relief. Like I wasn't crazy, like someone else finally saw it and refused to let them bury it under another round of Tyler's the Star. For the first time in forever, I didn't have to be the one explaining or justifying. Mark had done it for me, and it was like watching someone hand me my own backbone in front of people who thought I didn't have one. Then the check came, and that's when things got surreal. Tyler, still pale from the ambush, pulled out the family card he loves to flash, the one that everyone assumes is his because it's in his wallet, and he tapped it on the reader with his usual swagger, except the machine blinked red, beeped twice, and declined. He tried again, same result. He looked confused, then annoyed, then finally looked at Dad like the answer would be sitting in his eyes, but Dad just froze, because what no one realized until that exact moment was that the card Tyler loved to wave around was never funded by him. Never covered by Dad, never part of any mysterious family account. It was mine, tied directly to my checking account, and before we even left for the dinner, I had already decided that if my dad pulled another stunt tonight, I was done, and so while Dad was making his toast, I was in the bathroom on my banking app, cutting off the automatic funding and canceling the card. So when Tyler's card failed and the waiter asked politely if he wanted to try another form of payment, he sat there frozen, turning red, whispering to Jenna like maybe she had cash in her purse, while the whole table watched him, not me. because suddenly the golden boy couldn't pay for his own birthday dinner, and all I had to do was sip my water and wait. And that's when it hit me. I had just changed the rules of the entire game without raising my voice, without giving a speech, without a single dramatic line. I simply stopped paying for the lie, and the room that had been cheering a minute ago went dead quiet, because for the first time, they couldn't pretend not to see it. What none of them knew yet was that this was only the beginning, because that card was just the first string I pulled, and once you start tugging, the whole web unravels. Here is what no one will ever tell you about being the so-called peacemaker in a family, the one who bites her tongue and pays the bill and smooths everything over. The one who is expected to sit in silence while others are praised for accomplishments they never truly achieved, and the one who carries the invisible load so that no one else has to feel uncomfortable. It works for a while. It buys temporary calm. But the price is that eventually you stop existing as a full human being in the eyes of the people who should see you most clearly, because all they notice is the absence of conflict, not the sacrifices that made it possible. I learned that the hard way, and after that birthday dinner, when the truth was finally dropped like a bomb on the table, I realized how deeply the silence had cost me, because people didn't just misunderstand me. They had built an entire narrative where my role was erased. For years, I told myself it was fine that Dad always bragged about Tyler's business deals even when I was the one quietly wiring him cash to keep his doors open until a client's check cleared, or that Mom would gush about the family gift. That helped with my parents' down payment, even though that gift came from a bonus I earned after working late nights for months, while everyone else in the office left at 5. I swallowed it when Dad told relatives that Tyler had helped out with Mom's hospital bill, while the reality was that I maxed out my HSA and still wrote a check to cover the deductible because I couldn't stand the thought of collection calls coming to their house. I thought I was being generous, that I was choosing love over recognition, but in truth I was training everyone to believe that Tyler was the star and I was nothing more than background noise. After the dinner, the family group chat, which usually buzzed with silly jokes and updates about who was cooking what for Sunday, turned into something darker. A few relatives said it was inappropriate to bring up money in public, others asked why Mark had to embarrass Dad, and still others started to ask questions I had never heard anyone in this family ask before. Like why Tyler always seemed to be the one celebrated when the receipts clearly showed otherwise. I didn't argue, I didn't rant, I didn't write long speeches to defend myself. I just sent a single screenshot, a spreadsheet Mark had built, with dates, amounts, and sources, no commentary, no accusations, just the raw numbers. I thought maybe 1 or 2 people would glance at it and then move on, but instead, it sat in the chat like a mirror no one wanted to look into, and people stopped typing their usual emojis and jokes because they couldn't pretend not to see it. What really shook me was not the silence, but the sudden shift in how people behaved outside the chat. Cousins who used to roll their eyes when I declined to cover yet another last-minute emergency suddenly became very polite, offering to split costs or saying, "We'll figure it out ourselves." Aunts who once brushed off my work as cute little consulting began asking how I managed to budget so effectively, though they still wouldn't admit aloud what they were really asking. How did I manage to keep everyone else afloat while being told I didn't count? And Mom, who has always been conflict avoidant to the point of near invisibility, started calling me late at night to say she never knew the amounts were that high and that she thought it was just little things here and there, and I had to bite my tongue not to scream. Because of course she knew. She signed the checks. She just didn't want to admit the scale because then she would have to face what Dad had done. But instead of exploding, I decided to make a move that would speak louder than any lecture. I redirected my giving. I took the money I had already planned to set aside for Tyler's inevitable next bailout and instead funded a small scholarship in his daughter's name, a straightforward, transparent fund that would pay for her extracurriculars, no matter what chaos her father stirred up. And in the paperwork, I added one condition: my dad could never administer it, never sign off, never use it for his pride games. It was mine, my contribution, tied permanently to my niece's future and untouchable by the people who had spent years rewriting my contributions as theirs. When the scholarship receipt arrived by email, I forwarded it to the same group chat without a single word. At first, silence again. Then, slowly, one cousin liked the message, then another, then an aunt asked quietly what it was, and then Tyler, who had been lurking, finally typed, "You didn't need to do that," which made me laugh out loud in my own kitchen because of course I didn't need to. Just like I never needed to pay his payroll, or float his rent, or cover mom's medical bills. But the point was not whether I needed to, the point was that I chose to, and this time, no one could take it from me. Later that night, Dad called, his voice tight, saying I needed to take down that nonsense before people got the wrong idea, and I almost felt sorry for him because he didn't realize the wrong idea was the one he had been selling for decades. I said calmly, "The bank has the right one now," and hung up. For the first time in years, I slept without grinding my teeth because I had finally stopped being the quiet one, not by screaming, not by demanding recognition, but by putting proof in places where silence could no longer erase it. And yet, even as I fell asleep, I knew this was just the second ripple in a much bigger wave, because when you finally stop paying for the myth, you discover just how many people were invested in keeping it alive. And I had only begun to uncover how far that myth really stretched. Only a few people bother to check the fine print unless something already feels off, and I wish I could say I was one of those people who always reads every clause and every line like it is a sacred text. But the truth is that I used to skim because I trusted the faces involved, which is why it hit me like a slow, cold wave when Mark sat me down at the kitchen table with a manila folder and said he had pulled copies of anything with my name on it from the last few years, not because he wanted to play detective, but because the dinner had shaken him into realizing that if my father could stand in front of a crowded room and erase me with a smirk, then there might be other erasures hiding in places where the consequences were not just hurt feelings but legal exposure, and that is how I found my signature attached to a loan I did not take, a neat, slanted version of my name co-signed on an equipment note for Tyler's business with a witness line that read, in small tidy letters, Richard Thompson. I stared at that page for a long time, and in that stretch of quiet, I replayed a harmless memory that suddenly did not feel harmless at all. A moment last spring when Dad insisted on picking up my mail while I was traveling for work because the box was going to overflow, and how he dropped it off in a stack with a little joke about how my life looked like a paper factory, and how I had laughed and tossed the bundle onto the counter, never once considering that something could have been slipped in, signed, returned, and filed as if I had consented, because when you are trained to keep the peace, you also get trained to assume the best, even when the best is not what is happening. The next morning, I called the credit bureaus and placed a fraud alert, not with shaking hands or tears, but with this steady voice I barely recognized as mine, and then I froze my credit, not because I thought my life would fall apart by lunchtime, but because I finally understood that I had been walking around with open doors while people who claimed to love me were comfortable stepping through them, and once that was done I called the bank and asked for an in-person appointment to review any account or instrument or loan that referenced me in any capacity, whether as primary, cosigner, guarantor, or emergency contact, and I booked it for the first available slot, which felt less like a meeting and more like a line I had drawn in wet cement that would harden the moment I showed up. Mark, who has the patience of a monk and the memory of a hard drive, had already drafted a preservation letter that requested the bank, the equipment dealer, and the originating finance company hold all related records, including application packets, IP logs for any electronic signatures, camera footage for in-branch signings, and internal correspondence that might show who handled the file and when, and while that sounds dramatic, it is actually just what you do when you realize your name might have been used without your knowledge, and I felt this click in my chest as I emailed those letters from my account and copied our attorney, not because I wanted a courtroom, but because I wanted the paper trail to stop pretending it was a fog. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls on you when you decide you will no longer ask permission to defend yourself, and I carried that quiet with me into the bank, where a manager with a careful smile led us into a small glass room and slid a printout across the table with the kind of neutral tone people use when they are afraid the truth might be contagious. And there it was again, the same cosign page, the same tidy witness line, And when I asked where the original was, he said it was stored off-site, but that a digital scan was considered primary for their records. And then he said the sentence that made my stomach drop and my back straighten at the same time, which was that for any dispute over a signature, the bank would need all parties present, including the witness, to verify the process and discuss next steps. And then he said my father's name like it was a formality, when in reality it sounded like a fuse. I kept my voice calm as I asked whether the bank had camera footage from the day the document was supposedly signed, and when he said he would check, I nodded and slid my own folder across the table, which contained not just my driver's license and signature samples from prior verified documents, but also a certified statement from the notary who had handled our mortgage refinance 2 years earlier, confirming the natural slant and pressure of my handwriting, and I watched his face shift from polite to attentive, because it is one thing to walk in angry and another to walk in prepared, and preparation is the language banks actually respect. On the way home, I did something I wish I had done years ago, which was to call Tyler's primary commercial client and request a brief, off-the-record conversation with their compliance officer, where I calmly explained that I was reviewing a loan file that implicated my name and that, as a matter of prudence, they might want to confirm that any certifications or financial disclosures provided by Tyler's company were accurate and current, because if there was a question about a cosigner, there might be questions elsewhere, and I said this without venom or drama, simply as a factual courtesy that any responsible partner would appreciate, and when I hung up, I did not feel guilty, I felt clean. That evening, while the sun slid down and the house settled into that after-dinner quiet that used to feel comforting, my phone buzzed with an email from the bank confirming that they had initiated a records hold and that a meeting would be scheduled with all relevant parties to review the loan documentation. And there at the bottom was a line that made Mark squeeze my hand and made me feel both vindicated and furious, because it read, "Witness on file, Richard Thompson," which meant that this was no misunderstanding, no sloppy clerk, no misfiled page that would evaporate under a desk lamp. This was my father's handwriting anchoring a document I never agreed to, and if he wanted to call me invisible, he had just made me impossible to ignore. My revenge, if you want to call it that, was not a speech or a scene but a move on the board that changed the entire game. Because before I even closed my laptop, I authorized our attorney to send formal preservation notices and a potential fraud inquiry to the dealer and the bank. And I attached a list of dates that placed my father and brother together on the day the loan was opened. And then, with the steadiness of someone who finally believes herself, I prepared a concise packet for Tyler's big client outlining the compliance expectations in their own contract, which is to say I did not threaten, I simply turned on the lights. When the banker called the next morning to propose a meeting time and added, almost casually, that my father would need to attend because his name appeared as the witnessing party, he paused and said there might also be branch camera footage to review. And I felt something cold and precise settle into place as I answered that I would be there, because if we were finally going to sit in the same room with the papers between us, then the days of shrugging and smirking were over, and the record would have to play the truth out loud. Silence can feel like oxygen when you have spent years suffocating under other people's stories, and after the bank confirmed that a meeting would be scheduled with all parties, including my father as the witnessing signature on a loan I never agreed to, I decided that I would not march around waving a torch or post rants on social media or stage a dramatic confrontation in the middle of Sunday dinner, because I have learned that when people live off myth, noise only feeds them, while facts, printed in black and white and placed exactly where accountability lives, do the quiet work of moving mountains that speeches never budge. So I poured coffee, opened my laptop, and assembled what Mark jokingly called my transparency packet. A calm bundle of bank statements, transfer confirmations, email receipts, and a simple timeline that did not editorialize or accuse, but instead laid out dates, amounts, and purposes in a way that any banker, any client, any committee chair, or any relative pretending not to understand would be forced to respect. I did not spray this packet across the whole internet or drop it in the family group chat for gossip to chew on, because I was not chasing applause or pity. I was tightening bolts in the only places that mattered, which meant Tyler's top 3 clients who needed assurance that the vendor they relied on was clean and solvent. The church finance committee that had once told me, with a smile that still stung, that I didn't have enough leadership experience to help with budgets even though I had been quietly carrying my parents' mortgage and triaging bills for years, and one cousin who never met a rumor he didn't polish and repeat at full volume during holiday gatherings. Each packet contained the same items. The timeline of my contributions to keep my parents' house from defaulting last winter, the transfers marked as bridged to Tyler's business account with the exact deposit dates that aligned suspiciously well with his public boasts about closing big contracts, and a notarized letter from our refinance notary confirming what my signature actually looks like, and each packet carried one short cover note in my even voice that said I was clarifying records for the sake of accuracy. No hard feelings, no accusations. Just housekeeping. Before I hit send or sealed any envelopes, I made one more choice that felt like rearranging furniture in my chest so I could finally breathe, which was to separate my mother from the mess my father had wrapped around her, because whatever else had gone wrong here, Mom was the one fielding medical bills and home repairs while Dad played emperor of appearances. So I met with an estate attorney and established a simple living trust that placed the family home in Mom's sole benefit with sensible protections and clear instructions, which meant that no matter how red my father's face turned when the myth unraveled, the roof over my mother's head would no longer be a poker chip on his table. And when the paperwork was drafted, I printed a clean summary and added it to my packet for Dad because I wanted him to see that I was done asking him to do the right thing and had started doing it myself. Only after those foundations were set did I call my father, not to beg or warn or float ultimatums in the air like threats he could swat away, but to offer him a choice that was fair, lawful, and perfectly reasonable, which was that we could meet privately. Put truth on paper, remove my name from anything I did not sign, affirm that any future financial decisions involving my identity would require my explicit consent, and sign a simple acknowledgement letter stating, in straightforward terms, that my contributions over the last several years had been misattributed and would no longer be hidden under anyone's pride, and if he chose not to sign, if he preferred bluster and denial, then the packet that was already prepared would be delivered more broadly, because while I did not relish the idea of forcing anyone's hand, I am no longer financing the lie that my labor, my money, and my name are expendable parts in my father's performance. When he answered, his tone was half outrage and half rehearsal, the way people sound when they have practiced their lines and are irritated to discover the production has been cancelled. And he launched into a familiar speech about family loyalty and keeping things private and the terrible optics of airing misunderstandings, and I listened without interrupting. Not because he deserved that courtesy, but because I wanted him to hear the quiet when he finally ran out of steam, and then I said, as evenly as I could, that loyalty is not a permission slip for forgery or for claiming credit for a daughter's money while telling the room she does not count, and that privacy is not the same as secrecy. And that from this moment on I would be operating on paper, not on speeches, which meant our next step was either a private signing of the acknowledgement and the trust transfer or a wider distribution of the records to any stakeholder with a legitimate interest. After a long silence, he said he needed to talk to Tyler, which was like saying he needed to consult the person with the most to lose before considering an honest path, and while he paused, I received a text from my mother, a rare, brave text from a woman who avoids direct conflict like it is fire, asking me to stop by when I could, and when I arrived that afternoon she pulled open the small kitchen drawer she keeps locked with a cheap key and handed me a worn envelope with my name written on it in her careful hand, saying she had held on to something just in case and wasn't sure it mattered, but thought I should see it, and inside was a copy of a letter from the bank addressed to my parents from last spring confirming receipt of updated account documents, including additions of authorized users and co-signers, with a carbon copy not to me but to my father's office, which answered a question I had been circling for days about how my name had been attached to things without my knowledge, because if mail about my identity was being routed to his desk, then my absence was not an accident but a feature. I hugged her, not because a hug solves anything, but because it is what you do when someone hands you a key to a door you did not know how to open. And on the drive home, I felt that mixture of fury and relief that comes when the fog lifts and the shapes in front of you are not monsters, but furniture you can finally arrange. And I promised myself that no matter how this unfolded, I would keep my actions measured and my evidence clean, because the people who built the myth will try to make you look wild while they appear reasonable, and there is nothing wilder than a woman who stops funding her own erasure and starts sending receipts to the exact addresses where truth has to be filed to take effect. That night, after I finalized the trust documents for Mom and queued the client letters for morning delivery, the banker emailed proposed times for the joint meeting and noted, in a single line that read like a fuse, that branch camera footage from the day of the equipment loan had been located and would be available for review, which meant that soon there would be no room for performances or polished lies or the line my father loves about misunderstandings, because we would sit in a room with real dates and real images and real signatures, and the story that has kept him comfortable for years would have to stare at itself without makeup. And while I am not naive enough to think that a single meeting fixes a lifetime of habits, I also know that when the lights come on in a room where people have been whispering, everything that mattered all along becomes impossible to ignore. There comes a point when you realize that waiting for someone else to do the right thing is just another form of surrender, and after weeks of gathering documents, sending quiet but precise packets, and drawing clear lines that my father and brother had never seen me draw before, I understood that the only way to end this was to make the final move myself, not with shouting, not with grand gestures meant for an audience, but with the kind of decision that permanently rearranges the balance of power so that no one can casually erase me again. By the time the bank meeting was scheduled, I already knew what the outcome would be. My father would deflect, Tyler would minimize, the banker would lean on process and protocol, and nothing meaningful would change unless I forced it. So while they were busy preparing excuses, I was busy acquiring the one thing that would make every excuse irrelevant: control of Tyler's loan. When the fraud inquiry opened, the bank quickly realized that the equipment loan tied to my forged signature was shaky enough to trigger scrutiny, and when loans become shaky, banks look for buyers who are willing to purchase the debt at a discount rather than sit on risk, which meant that with the help of our attorney and Mark's financial acumen, I was able to quietly buy the note from the secondary market for far less than its face value. It was a surreal experience, knowing that for years my money had been used to cover gaps for my brother without recognition, and now, in one deliberate stroke, I had legally positioned myself as the holder of his debt. Not through trickery or malice, but through the very system he and my father had tried to manipulate, and once the papers cleared, I did not rush to announce it. I simply waited, knowing the day would come when the terms would matter more than the lies. At the meeting, exactly as expected, my father leaned back in his chair with the same smug smirk that had burned me during that birthday toast, calling the signature confusion a clerical error, while Tyler rolled his eyes and muttered that he didn't even remember who signed what because that's just how business works sometimes. The banker presented the camera footage, which showed my father in the branch on the day of signing with a pen in his hand, and the room grew tight with silence. But even then, Dad tried to spin it, saying he was helping move the process along, as if forging his own daughter's name was just a favor done in the spirit of efficiency. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I didn't even raise my voice. I simply laid a folder on the table that contained the assignment of the loan, and I explained, in steady words, that I was now the creditor of record, which meant that any discussion about repayment or terms would be directed to me, and suddenly the room shifted. Because in that moment, every ounce of bluster collapsed under the weight of plain ownership. Tyler's face turned from cocky dismissal to stunned disbelief as he realized that the loan he had been coasting on was no longer just numbers on a page, but a contract now owned by his sister, who had spent years financing his failures without acknowledgement and had finally decided to collect in a way he could not dodge. My father's smirk tightened into a grimace, because the leverage he had used to keep me quiet, the constant insinuation that family obligations trumped fairness, evaporated the moment the law said otherwise, and for the first time in my adult life, I watched him sit in silence without a story to shield him. But I did not use the leverage to crush Tyler, because cruelty was never my aim, and I knew that destroying him outright would only reinforce my father's narrative that I was vindictive. Instead, I rewrote the terms in a way that forced accountability while protecting the people who deserved protection. The loan was restructured with strict conditions. Tyler would make documented payments on time, with no hidden transfers or last-minute bailouts, and any default would trigger asset repossession that flowed not back to the bank, but directly into the trust one had already established for Mom. In other words, if Tyler failed, the house became safer, not weaker, and for once my contributions were not invisible, they were structural, unerasable, legally binding, and permanently recorded. I presented these terms calmly, not as punishment but as the new reality, and I told them plainly that this was the last payment I would ever make for the myth that Tyler was the star while I was the shadow, because from here on out, every dollar, every asset, and every sacrifice would carry my name attached, and no one would be allowed to pretend otherwise. My father started to argue, but I cut him off, not with anger but with precision, telling him that the documents were already filed, the trust was already funded, and the only choice left was whether he wanted to sign the acknowledgement I had drafted. A short, simple statement confirming that my prior contributions had been misrepresented or face broader exposure through legal filings that would pull every stakeholder into the light. He signed, jaw clenched, pen pressing harder than the paper deserved, and he slid the page back without a word, and I did not need him to speak, because the signature itself was the surrender, the admission he had sworn he would never make. When we walked out of that building, Tyler avoided my eyes. Dad marched ahead like a man refusing to look back, and Mom, who had sat quietly in the corner through the whole ordeal, squeezed my hand so tightly that I thought my bones might break, and she whispered, "Just loud enough for me to hear. Now we can finally sleep." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Mark, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of exhaustion that doesn't crush you, but empties you in a way that makes room for peace. I had not yelled, I had not begged, I had not waited for them to change. I had used the same tools they had abused: contracts, signatures, money, and I had turned them into my defense, my shield, and my victory. The house was safe, the debt was in check, the myth was broken, and my place in the family story could no longer be edited out with a smirk. Will my father ever apologize out loud? Probably not. Will Tyler ever thank me for structuring his survival instead of letting him collapse? Doubtful. But that no longer matters, because the goal was never their gratitude. The goal was to stop paying for a lie and to build a system where the truth could stand on its own. I won, not because they admitted defeat, but because I made the rules impossible to bend without me, and as far as I'm concerned, that is the last payment I will ever owe to the star of the family myth that died the moment I decided my worth would never again be hidden.